So I was watching telly the other night, and Theresa May came up on it. I know, on my telly. It's like you think she'd know better, but anyway, she came on, and I was just about to throw my shoe at the telly, and I suddenly thought, hang on. All we've heard for weeks is strong and stable.
The strong and stable leadership.
Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit.
Breakfast. Brexit. Brexit does mean breakfast.
Blah, blah, blah. I thought maybe this is a chance for her to actually explain some of her policies. And then I thought, if I'd just been given an opportunity to go on telly and spend half an hour explaining exactly what it is I'm trying to get people to vote for, I'd be pretty pissed off if nobody tuned in to watch it either. So I thought, let's give it a go.
Well, as I say, the only poll that counts is the one that actually takes place on the 8th of June. You know, so much depends on us getting those Brexit negotiations right. And you need strength in those negotiations and a strong and stable leadership that I think it needs, as I've just explained, particularly for those Brexit negotiations. And going beyond that, a plan for a stronger Britain for the future.
Now, there's a lot of waffle and there's not an awful lot of substance there, but as the interview went on, they started talking about the NHS, and suddenly my ears pricked up.
The manifesto pledges, quote, the most ambitious programme on investment in buildings and technology the NHS has ever seen. Is that part of the 8 billion?
No, that's a separate, because it's the money that you spend on, as I'm sure you know, Andrew, but the money you spend on buildings and capital is separate from the money you spend on a day-to-day.
Now, what she said there, the money you spend on capital is different to the money you spend on your day-to-day running costs.
There's a £58 billion black hole in the Labour Party manifesto.
Now, Theresa's very good at pointing out the difference between capital spending and day-to-day running costs when it comes to her own manifesto and her own plans, but for everybody else she fails to recognise it and just calls it a big black hole.
That money come from?
That money will be following. There's a report that was done on the NHS, the Naylor report, which set out what was needed, and we're backing the proposals in the Naylor report.
Now, the Naylor report, that's not the usual government sort of guff, just full of numbers and pie charts and all that kind of boring stuff. It's quite descriptive. There's quite a lot in there, and it lays out a plan for the NHS. None of this stuff is hidden away. It's all there. It's just so mind-numbingly dull, nobody wants to read it. Just go on Google, type in the Naylor report, and up it comes. First hit. So I clicked on it, and I started reading. Now, this document is basically an outline plan for essentially selling off the NHS assets. It makes a passing reference to maintaining and looking after old buildings, but then quite literally in the next paragraph it says there's no business case for this, so let's just flog everything off. Now, you can pause this video at any time, take a look at the URLs, I've deliberately left them in the screenshots, and you can read these documents for yourself. They really are boring, but it's worth having a look. Now, so keen is this report on getting rid of NHS assets, it actually encourages the government to match the funding. It even uses the words 2 for 1 in the document. It's crazy. This document recommends that HMRT, that's Her Majesty's Treasury, should provide additional funding to incentivise land disposals through a 2 for 1 offer. It's almost like one of those fire sales where people are just getting rid of stuff because they need to get rid of it. And that's essentially what's happening here. Now, if you're a hospital and you've got severe budget deficits and you need to get on top of those, it might actually be beneficial to sell your assets for less than they're worth, because you know that you're going to get the same amount again from the government. So in a sort of perverse way, rather than getting the most for the assets, there's actually an incentive there to just sell them as cheaply as possible, because the government will make up the difference. Now, how do you go about selling NHS assets. It's going to be pretty costly. Well, in the Naylor report, it even mentions the cost, and it's somewhere in the region of £10 billion.
It's £10 billion.
And where will that come from?
That will come from a variety of sources. It's capital money. It's separate from the £8 billion that's going into the National Health Service.
Now, that £10 billion that Theresa May has just committed, that's not £10 billion of extra spending as we would understand it. That's not £10 billion to be spent on new hospitals or nurses or improving patient care. That's £10 billion to prepare your assets to sell to a private developer. Now, the NHS is a massive organisation. How on earth is it going to get rid of these assets? Well, it turns out it's actually quite easy. When the Tories came to power, around about 2012, I think it was, they basically abolished primary care trusts. They got rid of them, and then they had all these assets, all these buildings and all this land left over. So they created a private limited company, and quite cleverly they called it NHS Property Services, NHSPS, appears quite regularly throughout the Naylor report. And they basically just gave all the assets over to this newly created company. They just gave it away. And that's because in the Naylor report, it says that the NHS, now remember, this is an enterprise that's been set up to make sick people better. The Naylor report says the NHS has deficiencies in strategic estate planning. Now, the whole Naylor report not only explains why it thinks selling NHS assets is such a brilliant idea, but it also says that it needs to be done quickly. This report recommends accelerating the rate at which we've already started selling off the NHS.
The Naylor report, which set out what was needed, and we're backing the proposals in the Naylor report.
So, NHS Property Services Limited. This is the company that owns all the NHS assets after they were just given to them. What do we know about these guys? It's dead easy. Just go on Google, type in NHS Property Services Limited, and bingo, up comes the answers. Nobody's trying to hide this. It's not like it's all squirreled away somewhere. They're just banking on the fact that it's so incredibly boring to wade through, nobody's going to take much of an interest. And up until very recently, I hadn't either. Now, NHS Property Services Limited has 2 people on the management team. And one of them is a Simon Stevens. Now, I'm sure Simon is a lovely bloke. I'm sure he's a great laugh down the pub, and he's probably one of the first to get a round of drinks in. There's probably even some small children somewhere who see him as some kind of kindly uncle figure. I'm not saying he's a sort of Voldemort kind of villain, but there's something a little bit sinister when you look into his past workings, his past companies that he's worked for, and the fact that he's now in charge of the entire asset portfolio for the NHS. Now, this is a guy who's supposed to be an expert in strategic estate planning, whatever the hell that means. But it turns out, if you look at his profile, he's just a health expert. I'm not even sure he's that. When you read into it, it says that he did a week's training as a porter before he went into NHS management. And a couple of years after that, he somehow became the head of United Health. Now, I'd never heard of United Health, so once again I went on Google, I typed in United Health and asked Mr. Google to tell me all about this company. And this company, they have something like $11 billion a year revenue. They're a massive healthcare company. They're actually listed in the Forbes 500. I think they're somewhere around number 6. They are the 6th largest company in the US. So here we have the Naylor report, which is recommending the NHS should dispose of all of its assets and dispose of them as quickly as possible. And in order to facilitate this, it's encouraging the government to throw a load of cash at it as well. Whatever it takes, they're desperate to get the NHS to get rid of land and property that it currently owns.
And we're backing the proposals in the Naylor report.
I know what you're thinking. What if you're a hospital trust and you don't want to get rid of your assets? Well, it gets better. But if you're a hospital and you own buildings and you own land, then you are charged 3.5% of the value of the estate. The Naylor report also says if provider plans are not embedded in STP plans which maximise disposals, they will not be eligible to access public capital funding. Now that particularly depressing sentence basically means if you're a hospital and you want money for capital expenditure, so that's things like new equipment, maybe an MRI scanner, or maybe you need to replace some of your old equipment, or maybe even it's just things like sheets for the beds. You've got to sell your land and property because the government is not going to give you access to public funding. So there we have it. Theresa May, she's a champion of the Naylor report, which basically says if you're a hospital, then you need to sell the land and the buildings that your hospital's built on, and if you don't, they will keep squeezing your budgets and keep denying you access to cash and funds until you do so.
And we're backing the proposals in the Naylor report.